Well, good morning. It's great to be here. The structural budget deficit is real and is worsening. I don't think there's any argument about that. And the government, whoever should be leading it, has three solutions. Three very simple solutions. Raise taxes, reduce expenditure, or achieve a higher rate of economic growth. That's the only solutions. There's no others. No magic wand you can raise here. And raising taxes, of course, is a very dangerous tactic to adopt in an economy which is as fragile as ours, and which, if the events of last week with the Reserve Bank are any indication, there is serious concern about its recovery and ongoing growth. Because raising taxes just has a direct impact on business and consumer confidence. Achieving faster economic growth will require significant reform in things like tax, labour markets, deregulation, infrastructure investment, skills and training, and I think in reform of the Federation. But even if you did all of those things, you'd have to cross your fingers in terms of the world economic growth scenario. Certainly the lower Australian dollar I think will help business, but probably that will take 3 years to kick in. But definitely the terms of trade are moving against us. Anyway, I think with that in mind, the government asked us to focus on reducing expenditure, and that's exactly what we did. And we had a very simple term of reference, which seems to have got lost in the chatter, and the government quite modestly said, how do we get to a 1% of GDP surplus by 23-24, so 10 years out? How do we get to a 1% surplus of GDP by 23-24? And essentially, that meant we had to find a way of reducing expenditure by about $65 billion per annum. 65 billion. And when we got into this, and the first briefing we got from Treasury, I've got to say, was quite horrifying, we could see that underlying the underlying causes of why we were in this situation were, firstly, and one I think we'd all accept, this rising sense of entitlement in Australia. Not just in persons, but in businesses and what have you. As soon as you've got a problem, government, come in and help me. And I think Joe Hockey gave an excellent speech before the election in London on that very issue, which of course got pilloried by some of the press back here in Australia, mainly in Fairfax. And then when we drilled into it, then we found that what's the signs of that? Well, what's happened over time, slowly but inexorably, and sometimes by the Conservatives, has been the indexation of entitlements is shifted. So things like the age pension now is on the average male weekly earnings. Not on average weekly earnings and not on CPI, but on average male weekly earnings. That's the strongest growing index in Australia. So those sorts of things have a big impact on the inexorable growth in these entitlements. The loosening of qualifications for entitlement, in other words, making it easier for more and more people to qualify for entitlement. And this can happen over time. It can even be by administrative interpretation. And then the pool of people who are entitled to something grows. And then the nail in the coffin, at a time when the tax take was reducing because company and personal income tax was down, i.e. economy slowing, we signed up to 3 major new programs at the federal level that really put us into a state of permanent structural deficit. And they were, of course, in disability, health and education. And one could make a good case for any one of those, that, these are good things to do and what have you, but taken together and taken with the other problems that were already built into the entitlement system, we were just driving a nail into the coffin. And of course this is exacerbated by an ageing population. Our population is ageing, fortunately through a robust immigration policy, which I fully support. We've probably slowed that rate down a little bit compared to other European and Western European economies. But it is inexorable. So at the current day, We have 5 people working for every person over 65. 5 working for every person over 65. The demographic, on a most conservative basis, says by 2050 we will have 2.7 people working for every person over 65. So just to maintain the current standard of living, that 2.7 will have to produce as much as 5 people today. And you can see the problem. We based our assumptions on for this study on what we thought was very reasonable. We assumed 3% per annum economic growth through to 23, 24 and beyond. Well, actually now that might be looking a little optimistic. We were worried about that, and we said that in a report because that would mean we'd have 30 years of consistent economic growth, which has never happened in Australia before, and it's probably very rarely happened in the world before. We inflation at 2.5%, probably about right. Labour productivity 1.6%, probably about right. And the terms of trade returning to where they were in 06-07. Again, we were probably optimistic because we didn't predict that the big collapse in commodity prices, which has actually occurred, and we're moving far faster to a worsening terms of trade. And we warned in our report that these assumptions were perhaps, could be regarded as optimistic, and this was the need. This is why we needed to move now and move firmly to correct this structural deficit, because we needed to build the reserve for the inevitable next economic downturn. At the moment, if we got hit with a GFC Mark II, we would have very limited capacity to respond in a financial stimulus way. It was a tough job. We had to analyse 409 billion of expenditure in 4.5 months, so it was a pretty tough job, and we spent less than $1 million doing it, which really frustrated the Senate committee that grilled us on it because they were expecting us to cost a lot more than that. And we had a very simple prescription. We just said, look, income tax at 24% of GDP, other revenue at 1% of GDP, customs and excise, that sort of thing. That brings you to 25%, and keep expenditure at a cap of 24% of GDP, giving you a 1% surplus. Very simple. At that time when we conducted the study, I'm not sure what it is now, income tax revenue was 21.8% of GDP, and expenditure was at 26% of GDP. So you can see under Labor, the expenditure had risen to 26% of GDP, whereas income tax was only at 22%. So that gap was there, ingrained and growing. But there was that sort of cargo cult mentality that, growth will take care of it. We'll get the growth going again. Well, growth doesn't happen by accident, and you can't run your country like a casino on the chances that world growth will take off and lift us. That's happened to us many times before, but who can afford to take that risk? So our approach was one of, we've got to cut back these entitlements, we've got to spread it across the whole community, business included. Business has its hand out as much as the community does. It's got to be incremental and it's got to be fair. And our principle was simple, and it's one I think your party subscribes to, is those that are going to afford to look after themselves, whether they be people or companies, should. And we should only look after those who cannot look after themselves, and that I think is a fundamental of Australian philosophy. And those that can't participate, we should encourage them to participate to the maximum extent that they possibly can. And our plan, I thought, was a sustainable plan. It was a fair plan. It returned the budget to surplus in the medium term and didn't do it overnight, but it was sustainable for the future. It was a plan that, if adopted, would not lead us into trouble post 23, 24 and as the population aged more. In looking at the Commonwealth, of course, you've got to be careful because the Commonwealth spends $409 billion a year approximately. It gives $95 billion to the states, spends about $50 or $60 billion on departmental expenditure, and gives out $264 billion in administered grants and payments to individuals. The Department of Human Services writes out cheques every day, 365 days a year, for $400 million. $400 million a day. So the only way you can rein in expenditure, you can attack the $50 billion a year in departmental expenditure, and God alone knows there's a lot of waste in that. But the only way you can correct this problem is by reducing expenditure against these major programs, by reducing these programs themselves. And doing nothing is not an option. If we did nothing, we've had 6 years of deficit, we'd have another 10 years of deficit, and deficits for the foreseeable future. And just rising, and no hope of paying it back. And I guess everybody knows now gross debt's at $600 billion, and the annual interest bill is just over $10 billion sort of thing. So we did focus on expenditure only, but we did look at GST, we did look at super tax concessions, family tax allowance B, those sorts of things. We looked at a few of those things, got criticised for that, but anyway, it's a free country. Allegedly. We looked at middle class welfare. That made us a lot of friends of the Liberal Party. We looked at our view was on health insurance. Those that can afford to look after their own health should look after their own health. So we said compulsory private health insurance. We looked at the seniors' health card. I didn't even know it really existed, although I probably could qualify for it. Just shows you what a dill I am. But we looked at that because one of our commissioners we're talking in the meeting, and he gets a text from a mate of mine. He says, I'm on the seniors' health card. I get free health care. I've got a $5 million house, $100,000 a year in tax-free superannuation. I qualify for a seniors' health card. Rubbish. Just disgraceful. Family tax allowance B, we think, was far too generous. It should be abolished. We fervently believed in co-payments because Medicare's out of control. As I said, GST, business welfare, we're against. We said include the family home in the means test for the age pension. You could have a $3 million house and still qualify for a complete age pension. Somebody on $80,000 a year that can't afford a house is paying tax to keep you in your $3 million house. Terrific. That's equitable, isn't it? Not really. So, we did sort of we tried to spread the burden. We focused on the 15 largest programs, and if you get a chance to go online and look at our report, just go to page 43, which I think encapsulates everything. It gives a table of all the major programs for the next 10 years and how much they're growing. And those 15 major programs account for 70% of the $280 billion increase in expenditure over the next 10 years, growing at 6.9% per annum. So 6.9% per annum. We've said inflation, 2.5%, economic growth, 3%. That's a long way short of 6.9% per annum. We're digging a hole. And how could any government, with all of these numbers at their fingertips, sign up to programs thinking they can afford a growth in expenditure of 6.9% per annum in their major programs? It is criminally negligent, in my view. That's kicking the can down the road. So we just run through some of them. Medicare, 7.1% per annum. Age pension, 6.2% per annum. Aged care, 7.5% per annum. Defence, if they gave them more money, as Defence always asked for, 7.2% per annum. Just more money wasted. Hospitals, 10.4% per annum. Higher ed, 5.4% per annum. That's modest, actually. Childcare and PPL, 11.5% per annum. Aid, 9.6% per annum. And, of course, disability, the slam dunk, 46.2% per annum. And surprisingly enough, when we got in there, the expenditure, was bad enough through the forward estimates, but it kicks in post the forward estimates. And because people don't look post the forward estimates, they don't realise this. So 2017-18, that's when the education You know, the Gonski reforms, the hospital's contribution, and NDIS really start to kick in. That's when this thing really takes off. So that 40 billion deficit will go way out post those, that unless we do something about it. We also had a plan to fix the federation. I was appalled by the state of Commonwealth-state relations. They have this incredible centralism in Australia, a complete ignorance and neglect of our constitution, the feeling that Canberra knows everything and can do everything best, when patently it can't. We have duplication, overlap, competition, and it costs the taxpayer a fortune, and we have programs that don't work because of this. Ridiculous. Devolution to the states is the answer. We have a state system. The states are here, fundamental to our constitution. We should support it. That went over really well in Canberra. There's 51 partnership agreements between the Commonwealth and the states. We've got Commonwealth public servants who could hardly find their way to work, lecturing the states on how they should deliver programs. Now, I'm not saying the states are perfect by a long shot, but at least they're delivering on a day-to-day basis, and if they muck up, they're on the front page of the Telly or the Sydney Morning Herald. On the Herald, they'll be there whether they muck up or not. But 51 partnership agreements, 230 implementation plans. Victorian government said to us the number of reports they have to give to the federal government doubled in 2012-13 to 180 reports. Queensland had one report that they had to give an annual report on a grant of $35,000. A $35,000 grant you have to report to the Commonwealth on? Probably 10 public servants in Canberra are now analysing it. So great public service waste. We found 932 Commonwealth-funded bodies. Average cost, minimum cost of a Commonwealth body is $1 million a year. 930. Finance said we don't even know whether that's the full number because there's no register and there's no control. So a minister comes in or a government comes in, let's get the XYJ advisory group going, appoint a chairman and 5 directors and fly them around the world to have a look at what the Inuits are doing and then come back and report. Yep, and we're paying for it. No accountability. No accountability. Grants. There is no process within government, and we're talking grants of 50, 100, 200 million a year, no process to see whether we're getting value for money out of those grants. There's no accountability. So instead of the Estimates Committee, Senate Estimates Committee, fiddling around on did the minister take his wife or not and did he have a good dinner in Paris, nobody's looking at, are we getting value for money out of these wretched grants? No accountability. Now ask Finance, why did you stop doing that? The minister was complaining, or the previous government, they didn't think it was worthwhile doing reviews every 2 or 3 years on whether we're getting value for money for these grants. Do you set KPIs? Yeah, very general. Do you measure against them? No. So I'm very big in Indigenous, so we did a review in Indigenous. Unbelievable. Every KPI bar 2 they'd gone backwards on despite a dramatic increase in expenditure. Well, who's accountable for that? Who's measuring that and saying we're wasting money? We found one community of 300 people who had 80 providers in that community running 80 separate programs, federal, state, non-profit level. Every KPI in that community had gone back. Child abuse, family violence, alcoholism, drug addiction, everything had gone back, despite 80 providers. Where's the money going? Into the providers. It's an industry. But who holds them to account on this? This is what the Senate Estimates Committee should be doing. David, that's your challenge. Get those doozy guys going. So I could go on and on forever on that, but of course... And the submissions we got from the departmental secretaries were just generally, I'd say, disappointing would be a polite term that I'd use this morning because it is Sunday. And I am an atheist. So we came up with a very simple set of rules. We said 1% of GDP surplus, that's good. And a country as prosperous and as wealthy and as endowed as us with a good education system, largely peaceful society, we should be able to do 1% of GDP per annum. Tax, 24% of GDP. You follow those two rules, we're safe. Not hard to do. Just takes a bit of discipline. We did assume that bracket creep would be adjusted for, because if we didn't, we'd find that those on the minimum wage would have a marginal tax rate of 32.5%. We had a good look at health, and people say, oh yeah, as a percentage of GDP we don't spend much, but we have the highest per capita spend on health in the OECD, highest per capita spend. And that's why we recommended a co-payment, a lot higher than the government endeavoured to do, but we thought we'd give them cover. I won't go into all of the stuff about co-payment, but Bob Hawke recommended $350. The Catholic Health Association said it would be worthwhile. A RAND study in the US, which is the only independent study I could find, showed that a co-payment does not reduce health outcomes, in fact does reduce cost. We have 353 million medical benefit services per annum in 13-14. That's an average of 15 medical benefit services per person per year. 15. Man, women, child, old, young, what have you. Of course, this gives us why the problem in health is going to really kick in. It's 33 services for those over 65. So 15 per person per year. As I said when I announced the report in Canberra, we're not that crook. We did recommend age pension retirement age at 77% of life expectancy at age 65, and that would be around 2053 before we get to 70. So that's not a big deal, but we said give people notice, do that slowly over time, tie it to life expectancy, because that has an impact on how long people can work. We said move from average male weekly earnings to average weekly earnings for the age pension. But do it over time to give people time to adjust to the lower rate. And of course we said there was a logical reason for that, because 50% of retirees are women, they're not all men. And in fact women live longer anyway.
And should be paid the same as men.
Pardon?
And should be paid the same as men.
And should be paid the same as men. I agree totally with that. We did have a look at workforce participation too, but if I could keep going all morning on that. We said the family home and the age test above 750,000 for a couple and 500,000 for a single, and again bring that in over 15 years. We thought that was reasonable, but it certainly didn't strike a chord. We were, in terms of the dole, the dole is not actually a real problem in Australia. That's growing at about 1.6% per annum, and I think it's more of a social problem than an economic problem in some respect, but we did notice that we have the highest minimum wage in the OECD. In youth unemployment, which I think is the real concern, is 13% and growing, and in some regions much higher than that. And so we suggested that, again, over a period of 10 years, adjust the indexation method to bring it back to about 44% of average weekly earnings. And we think that would in fact help encourage youth employment. We said business welfare, eliminate it unless there's a clear sign of market failure, and only for transitional purposes. No permanent ongoing business welfare. And I think that all praise to the government on that. They've certainly done that in the auto industry. I mentioned grants and programs and the measuring their long-term effectiveness and outcomes. In terms of industry, we said if you don't give business, grants and subsidies and what have you, get out of that cycle, but you also got to get the cost of doing business down. Labour market deregulation, energy supply and costs, and economic infrastructure. You do that, make business more efficient, it'll be more competitive, it won't need a subsidy. We got criticised for saying that it was a crisis and emergency, and I said, well, no, it's not really. Debt's at about 16-17% of GDP. That's good by global standards, but the issue for us is it's going in the wrong direction. We had one of the fastest rates of growth in the deficit of any OECD country. We're running against the trend of the rest of the world. And I was reminded, I'm a bit of a Hemingway fan, in Hemingway's The Sun Always also Rises, one of the guys says to the other guy, how did you go bankrupt? And he said, gradually at first and then suddenly. And that's what we're facing. No sane commentator or economist has criticised our projections. Plenty have criticised our proposed solutions. And as I said, there are other solutions, but they've got to be very carefully dealt with, whether they be increases in tax or trying to encourage growth in the economy, which I think is going to be very, very difficult to do. The top New Zealand marginal rate of tax is 33% and its company tax rate is 28%. The UK company tax rate is 21%. In Sweden, the poster child of the Social Democrats, is about 23%. It's fair to say that both the UK and New Zealand have higher rates of growth than Australia, and they don't have the benefit of richness in resources. So nothing has changed since our report last year. Nothing has changed. It's only got worse. The Senate, with the one notable exception, and the opposition are in denial. Governments and leaders might change, but the situation doesn't get any better. And those that say we have a problem but can't come up with a solution, they are the ones that are really letting this country down. And I'm talking people in the Labor Party and what have you that know we've got a problem, criticise any solution, but do not come up with a realistic alternative. So the question for us is, do we throw our children and our grandchildren under the bus, continue to borrow to pay ourselves, or do we accept sensible, fair and equitable reform over time and ensure that we have a secure, and our children and their children have a secure economic future? And we can't get stronger economic growth if our government is going backwards. It is a fundamental in modern Western capitalist type societies that if the government is going backwards, the economy will also go backwards with it. And as I said, look across the ditch to New Zealand. Fiscal reform, stronger rate of growth, lower taxes and no resources. So my advice to the government, whoever it may be, explain the budget situation to the community clearly and simply, and explain it until you are blue in the face, over and over again. You will get it through. And John Howard used to say, when you get to the stage of saying something so often that you feel like you're going to vomit, you can assume then that you're just starting to get it through the community. And that's what he did with the GST, he and Costello with the GST. They sold that tax. A 10% GST, they sold it. They had 80% community acceptance after 2 years of constant marketing. Is the cake in the GST, is the candle on the cake? Answering 1,000 dumb questions every day, all over the country, community groups, Rotaries, what have you. That's what it takes to sell. Can't do it from Canberra. People don't believe anything coming out of Canberra. Institute reforms which are fair, incremental and consistent, and ensure that all those that can help themselves, and protect those who can't. And don't be small-minded in the protection of those that can't. And the priority is then paying down the deficit. Everything you should do, but it should be consistent with paying down the deficit. Don't think, oh yeah, we're paying down the deficit, we'll spend a little money here and we'll spend a little money there. You have to be consistent. People understand consistency. And again, sell those reforms until you're blue in the face. And I have great faith in the average Australian, they will accept them in the end. And then every other government decision, every decision that comes up to that cabinet table, ask yourself a very simple question. Does this encourage long-term and sustainable growth and jobs? Does this encourage long-term sustainable growth in the economy and growth in jobs? And if the answer is no, don't do it. If the answer is yes, then do it. Very simple. And I got that prescription from, again, across the ditch. That's what the New Zealand cabinet does. That's what John Key does before he looks and his finance minister does and his cabinet does before they make a decision on anything. Will this grow the economy or not? If it grows the economy, then we better have a very good reason not to do it. Thank you.